If you just got a brand new mirrorless or DSLR camera, sometimes the settings can be overwhelming. Now I've had my Sony ZV-10 for about 5 months now, and I finally gotten to a point where I can easily nail my exposure on this camera when I'm shooting video. So in this video, I'm going to go over shutter speed, ISO, and aperture and explain how each of these settings affect your exposure while filming. Now I know as a beginner, it might be tempting to just set everything to auto when you don't understand how the settings work. But in this video, I'm going to break it down for you guys. Now when it comes to exposure, you really only need to know how these three settings work. And these three settings are your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. And after that, you're pretty much good to go, as these are the settings that make up the exposure triangle. Okay, now before we go over the different exposure settings, I want to take a quick moment to mention my collab with IcyStar. Now IcyStar is a sneaker company that specializes in selling high quality rep sneakers. And as you may know, it can be very hard to find certain colorways or styles of your favorite shoes at retail, and even when you do, they can be pretty expensive. But IcyStar has almost all of their shoes in stock, and they sell many replica colorways of popular sneakers for half the price or even less than that compared to what you can find them at for retail. Now IcyStar reached out to me to check out their website, and I was pretty impressed by the options they have. Some of the shoes that stood out to me were the flea market Air Force Ones, the Air Jordan 1 Low Coconut Milk Sails, as well as the Nike Dunk Genesis OGs. With so many shoes to choose from, I highly recommend checking out their website at icystar.ru, especially if you've been eyeing a certain colorway of your favorite sneaker, but you don't want to pay an arm and a leg for it. IcyStar's got your back. And if you decide to purchase anything from their website, then make sure to use my code Peavey to get $15 off of your first order. I'll also make sure to leave IcyStar's website as well as all of their socials in the description down below. A huge thanks to IcyStar for reaching out, and now let's get back to the video. Now in simple terms, the exposure triangle refers to the camera settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that work together to control the amount of light reaching the camera sensor, thus determining the overall exposure of an image. And I also wanted to note that just by simply knowing how shutter speed, ISO, and aperture works, it can take you a very long way when it comes to filmmaking and getting those cinematic shots that you see in a lot of Hollywood films and movies. So if you're looking to become a professional filmmaker or even to enhance the videos of your social media content creation, then this video should really help you out. Now starting off with shutter speed. Now the simple definition of shutter speed is the length of time a camera's shutter remains open when taking a photo or shooting video. So the lower your shutter speed is, the more light your camera will let into the sensor, and the higher your shutter speed is, the less light your camera will let into the sensor. Now when you're shooting video, you always want to set your shutter speed to double your frame rate, and the reason for this is to prevent any motion blur so that your footage looks nice, smooth, and natural. So if you're shooting at 30 FPS, you want to set your shutter speed to 1/60. If you're shooting at 60 FPS, you want to set your shutter speed to 1/120. And if you're shooting at 24 FPS like I am right now, then on the ZV-10 at least, you're going to want to set your shutter speed to 1/50, because this is the closest that you can get to double 24 FPS. At least on the ZV-10. Now when it comes to actually adjusting the shutter speed on the ZV-10, it's pretty simple. On this camera, all you have to do is go to the dial on the back of the camera and scroll this dial back and forth to adjust and choose the shutter speed that you want to use. Now the next setting in the exposure triangle is your ISO. Now your ISO controls how sensitive your camera is to light. So the lower your ISO, the darker your image is going to be, and the higher your ISO, the brighter your image is going to be. Now when it comes to ISO, I would always try to keep it at either the base ISO or as low as possible to avoid getting a noisy image. Now, some cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K have what's called a dual native ISO feature, and this basically means that you'll have two base ISOs. So your first base ISO will be a lower ISO number. In the case of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, your first base ISO would be 400. And then this camera also has a higher base ISO, or a higher ISO, and in the case of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K, again, the second ISO on this camera would be 3200. Now, from what I know, the Sony ZV-10 only has one base ISO, so it doesn't have that dual base ISO feature. And the base ISO on this camera, at least from what I've researched and looked up, is 100. So whenever I'm shooting video, I always try to keep my camera at an ISO of 100. Now, in order to keep your ISO at a very low base ISO, or a very low number like 100, like I have on my ZV-10 right now, you're gonna have to have a good lighting setup to compensate for that. Now, I have two key lights that get very bright, as well as daylight that comes in through my windows during the day. So this provides plenty of lighting for my videos, which easily allows me to keep my ISO very low when I'm shooting indoors like I am right now. Now, if you're in a low light environment, or you don't have a lot of key lights to use to brighten your image, then you're probably going to have to raise your ISO some in order to keep your footage perfectly exposed. But just remember, don't raise it up too much so that you don't introduce noise in your image, and always try to keep it at the base ISO if you can. So if you're struggling with low light issues, then I would highly recommend investing in some key lights like the ones that I have, and I'll link both of the key lights that I'm using right now in the description below in case you want to check them out for yourself. Now, in order to adjust the ISO on the Sony ZV-10, it's simple. Again, you're going to want to go to the dial on the back of the camera, and then you're going to want to press the side of the dial that's labeled ISO, and from here you'll be able to scroll the dial and choose the ISO that you want to use. All right, and now moving on to aperture. Now, in simple terms, your aperture is the opening of your lens in which light passes through your camera. So the lower your aperture is, the more shallow depth of field you're going to have in your image, and the higher your aperture is, the less shallow of a depth of field you're going to have in your image. And also, the higher the aperture is on your camera lens, the less light your lens is going to let into the camera, and then vice versa, right? The lower your aperture is on your camera lens, the more light your camera lens is going to let into your camera. Now, when it comes to aperture, it's all personal preference. It's going to come down to the shot that you want to get. So whether you want the background to be blurry and, you know, the subjects in front to be in focus, or whether you want like the whole scene to be in focus of whatever you're shooting. Now, when it comes to me shooting talking head videos like this one, I always like to set my aperture to the lowest that my camera lens can go to, which is an aperture of f1.4, as I'm using the Sigma 16mm lens right now. And this allows me to get a blurry background that you're probably seeing right now, and allowing me as the main subject to be the one in focus, which just allows me to stand out from the contrast of the background. Now, like I said, aperture is going to come down to personal preference. So it's going to come down to how much of your scene you want to be in focus, how much you don't want to be in focus. But it's also important to note that the higher you set your aperture number to, the darker your footage is going to be, right? Because the less light your camera lens is letting in. But then the wider you set your aperture, right? And if you have a lens that can go really wide like mine, it's going to let in a lot of light. So you might need to compensate for this by adjusting your ISO as well. And this kind of explains how all the three settings settings right, your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture affect the exposure of your image, which is why all three of those settings are grouped into what is called the exposure triangle. Now, in order to adjust the aperture on the Sony ZV-E10, all you have to do is go to the dial that's at the top of the camera, and you can just scroll this left and right, and this will allow you to adjust the aperture that's on your camera lens. So you can bring it down the lowest your camera lens can go to, or you can bring it up higher if you want more things to be in focus. But yeah, it's very, very easy to do this on the ZV-E10. In conclusion, to wrap everything up, here's a recap of the key takeaways. Number 1, for shutter speed, always set it to double or as close to double as you possibly can of whatever frame rate you're shooting at. Number 2, when it comes to ISO, the higher your ISO is, the brighter your image will be, and the lower your ISO is, the darker your image will be. However, always try to set your ISO to one of your camera's base ISO levels, or to the lowest ISO number that your camera can go down to eliminate noise and to get the cleanest image possible. And number 3, for aperture, the lowest your aperture can go down to will all depend on the lens that you're using. A lower aperture is going to give you a more shallow depth of field, or in other words, a blurrier background, whereas a higher aperture is going to give you a less shallow depth of field, as more things in the camera shot will be in focus. It's also important to mention that the lower your aperture number is set to on your lens, the more light that lens will let into the camera's sensor. And the higher your aperture number is set to your lens, the less light your lens will let into the camera's sensor. Now, this video should have taught you all the important things that you need to know in order to master the exposure compensation of your camera. But if you have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this from me, where I go in depth into more filmmaking and content creation subjects in the future, then definitely make sure to let me know that in the comments down below as well. And if you're a new aspiring content creator or filmmaker looking to get started on your phone, then I highly recommend you watch my full tutorial on how to get cinematic footage on an iPhone, as well as my KNF concept variable ND filter review, where I go more in depth into how ND filters work. And I highly recommend getting an ND filter if you're going to be vlogging or filming outside or anywhere where there is a ton of light, as an ND filter is almost necessary to get good looking footage in these scenarios. And I'll leave these videos in the end screen above. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, turn on those push notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.